A millionaire takes his new girlfriend out to dinner, but when he sees his ex-wife working as a janitor.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The Paradise restaurant glowed brightly with dazzling lights, and the soft sound of jazz music resonated throughout the luxurious space. Tables were covered with pristine white tablecloths, carefully set with sparkling crystal glasses. This was a place frequented only by the upper class. Richard entered, striding confidently in a perfectly tailored suit. Beside him was Lucy, a youthful woman with long, lustrous brown hair and a meticulously made-up face. Lucy held her head high, her gaze smug as she looked around. "Richard, this place is perfect. You really know how to pick a spot," she said, her voice drawn out with an air of haughtiness. Richard smiled, unable to hide his pride. "Of course, my dear. I only want the best for you." As the two walked in, the eyes of the restaurant patrons all turned toward them. Richard was used to this. He enjoyed the feeling of being noticed, of being admired. "Good evening, sir and madam," a waiter, Sam, approached them and bowed. Sam was a young man with neatly combed black hair and polite eyes. "I'll take you to your reserved table." Lucy glanced at Sam from head to toe, then smirked slightly. "I hope our table is private enough. I don't want to be disturbed by the crowd," she said, deliberately emphasizing the last two words. Sam hesitated slightly but maintained his smile. "Of course, ma'am." When they reached the table, Lucy sat down with the air of someone who owned the entire restaurant. She glanced at the menu and laughed. "Richard, these dishes are ridiculously expensive. But you know, I like that." Richard laughed heartily. "Order whatever you like, darling. I'll take care of it." While Richard and Lucy were chatting, Sam returned with a bottle of red wine. "Here's the wine you requested, sir. I'll pour it right away." Lucy raised her hand, signaling him to stop. "Wait. I want a different bottle. This one doesn't look classy enough." Sam blinked, slightly puzzled. "Ma'am, this is the highest-rated wine in our restaurant." Lucy gave a faint, dismissive laugh. "Highly rated by whom?" "I'm not interested in highly rated. I need perfection. Do you understand?" Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, clearly entertained by Sam's discomfort. "Do as she says, young man. Don't waste our time." Sam bowed, hiding his irritation. "I'll bring another bottle right away." As Sam left, Lucy leaned in and whispered to Richard. "Did you see that? This kind of service is laughable. That waiter has no idea how to do his job." Richard chuckled, a feeling of smug satisfaction spreading through him. He liked how Lucy wasn't afraid to make things difficult for others. To him, it was proof that she belonged in the lavish life he was creating. But Richard's pleasure was interrupted when his gaze caught a familiar face approaching from a distance. It was a female server with short, neatly cut hair, dressed in the restaurant's uniform. Richard froze momentarily, then let out a cold smile. "Carla," he murmured. Lucy turned, her curiosity piqued. "Who?" Richard gestured forward. "My ex-wife. She's working here as a server." Lucy followed his gaze, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Really? How intriguing. I never expected we'd get the chance to see her here." Carla approached, doing her best to maintain her composure even though she had noticed Richard and Lucy from afar. She didn't want any confrontation. After all, she was at work. "Good evening, I'm Carla, your server for tonight," Carla said, her tone calm but her eyes resolute. Lucy laughed lightly. "Oh, what a surprise. You're working here, Carla. I didn't think I'd see you in this situation." Richard raised an eyebrow, his face smug. "You must be quite busy. But don't worry, we'll try not to trouble you too much." Carla didn't reply, only taking their orders as professionally as she could. However, she could feel the mocking gazes of Richard and Lucy. "Carla, I think you forgot something," Lucy said as Carla was about to leave. "Aren't you going to say anything to us? After all, we're old acquaintances." Carla turned back, maintaining her composure. "Enjoy your dinner." Lucy watched her walk away, smirking. "She's a woman who knows her place." Richard laughed loudly. "I don't think she has anything else to say, my love. We've won." Carla turned her back, walking away with steady steps, but inside, she felt a fire burning. She refused to let Richard and Lucy see her weakness. In another corner of the restaurant, Sam stood watching, his eyes filled with sympathy. A few other staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. Richard and Lucy continued laughing and talking, oblivious to the increasingly cold stares from the staff and patrons around them. Carla took a deep breath, trying to stay calm as she entered the kitchen. She placed the order tray on the counter and looked at Sam, who was standing nearby. "Are you okay?" Sam asked, his eyes full of concern. "I'm fine," Carla replied briefly. But she knew she wasn't. Richard's presence, especially with Lucy, a woman radiating smugness, brought back painful memories. "Carla, if you need, I can take over that table," Sam offered, trying to help. Carla shook her head. "No, thanks. I'll handle it myself." Even so, she couldn't stop the pain and simmering anger inside her. Richard hadn't just shown up unexpectedly, he had intentionally tried to humiliate her at her workplace. Carla told herself she couldn't let these emotions affect her job. Outside, Richard took a sip of wine, looking around with a smug expression. "Isn't it interesting to see Carla here, my love?" Lucy smirked. "Interesting? What do you think she would do after losing you? Someone like her can only work as a server. That's her limit." Richard nodded. "Exactly. She's nothing but a failure." Lucy leaned forward, her eyes sparkling as though she'd just thought of something amusing. "I have an idea. What do you think if we play with her a bit more? Let's see how she reacts." Richard smirked. "I have no objections. Do whatever you want." Not long after, Carla returned with a tray of food. She carefully placed each dish on the table with professionalism, avoiding direct eye contact with either Richard or Lucy. "This is the appetizer you ordered," Carla said, her voice calm. Lucy looked down at the plate of food, then frowned. "Carla, are you sure this is what I ordered?" "I don't think it is." Carla maintained her composure. "Ma'am, this is the bruschetta di Parma you requested." "Is that so?" Lucy said, raising her voice. "I don't think this is how a high-end restaurant serves its food. Richard, what do you think?" Richard shrugged, feigning irritation. "I'm not sure, but Lucy might be right. Carla, maybe you should double-check. We don't want to eat something that's incorrect." Carla took a deep breath, trying to suppress her emotions. "I'll check again in the kitchen." Lucy smirked as Carla walked away. "What an incompetent server. It's a shame she hasn't learned anything since she left you, Richard." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "But as I said, my love, we don't need to concern ourselves with people like her." Carla returned to the kitchen, this time her hands gripping the serving tray tightly. Sam immediately approached her. "What happened now?" "Nothing," Carla replied, but her eyes said it all. Meanwhile, Lucy decided to escalate her game. "Richard, I think we should speak to the manager. A restaurant like this shouldn't have such terrible service." Richard chuckled. "Good idea. Carla is bound to get reprimanded." Lucy raised her hand, calling out loudly, "Who's the manager here? I'd like to speak to them immediately." Nearby customers began to turn and look. A few frowned, clearly annoyed by Lucy's loud behavior, but she paid no attention. An older staff member, Alexander, hurried over. He was the evening shift manager, a small-framed man with sharp eyes. He had worked at the restaurant for years and knew Carla well. "Good evening, sir and ma'am," Alexander said in a composed tone. "I'm the evening manager. How can I assist you?" Lucy crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes icy. "Yes, you can assist me by retraining your staff. Carla, our server, is clearly not qualified to work here." Alexander hesitated briefly but quickly regained his composure. "I'm very sorry to hear about your experience. However, I can assure you that Carla is one of our best employees." Richard interrupted. "Your best? If this is your best, I can't imagine what the others are like." Alexander remained polite, though his eyes revealed his displeasure. "I will speak to her to improve the service. But if there's anything else you need, please let me know." Lucy raised an eyebrow, still dissatisfied. "Good. I hope you handle this right away." As Alexander walked away, Richard laughed. "Do you think Carla will get punished? If not, maybe we should teach her a lesson ourselves." Lucy nodded, a sly smile spreading across her lips. From afar, Carla could see all their actions. She couldn't hear their words, but their expressions and gestures said everything. She knew this wasn't over. Carla tried to remain calm as she returned to Richard and Lucy's table, even though her emotions were roiling inside her. Their taunts and deliberate attempts to make her life difficult felt like sharp knives cutting into her pride. But Carla refused to let Richard and Lucy see her hurt. She knew the only thing she could do was remain professional. "Sorry for the wait, here's the new appetizer you requested," Carla said as she placed the new plate on the table, her tone steady. Lucy glanced at the food in front of her, her eyes glinting with provocation. "Finally, it's correct," she said, dragging out her words. Then, immediately, she turned to Richard and giggled. "What do you think? Do you think she'll manage to bring the main course correctly, or will we have to wait again?" Richard laughed loudly, his mocking gaze fixed on Carla. "I don't know, but I think Carla might need to try a bit harder. After all, I always thought she was very good at a few things." Richard's suggestive tone made Lucy burst out laughing. Carla felt her face flush, but she didn't let any emotion show. "I'll make sure the main course is prepared perfectly," she said curtly before turning and walking away. Lucy watched her go, her expression full of smug satisfaction. "It's so entertaining to see her like this. I never thought being a server would suit her so well." Richard leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine. "My love, I think we should enjoy this game a bit longer. She thinks she can keep her composure, but I know Carla too well. She'll lose control soon enough." In the kitchen, Carla set the tray down on the counter and took a deep breath. Sam stepped closer, lightly placing a hand on her shoulder. "Carla, you don't have to endure this. If you want, I can take over their table," Sam said, his gaze full of concern. Carla shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "No need, Sam. I don't want them to think they can bring me down." "But they're clearly trying to make things hard for you," Sam said, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "You don't have to prove anything. Everyone knows you do your job well." Carla gave him a tired smile. "Thank you, Sam. But this isn't just about work. This is about me not letting them win." Sam nodded, though his worry lingered. He knew Carla was strong, but he also understood the pain and frustration Richard and Lucy were deliberately inflicting on her. Back at Richard and Lucy's table, the tension continued to build. A few customers nearby began whispering among themselves, casting glances in their direction. Lucy didn't care. In fact, she seemed to relish being the center of attention. "Richard, what do you think we should do next?" "I want to see just how far she can go," Lucy said, her voice low but clear enough for Richard to hear. Richard smirked. "Let's see, my love. Maybe we should make her feel like she doesn't belong here at all." At that moment, Carla returned with a tray of food. She carefully set the main courses in front of Richard and Lucy, her movements precise and deliberate. "Here are the steak and salmon you ordered. Enjoy your meal," Carla said, her voice calm. Lucy wasn't done. "Wait a moment, Carla. I think my salmon is missing something." Carla furrowed her brows slightly. "Missing what, ma'am?" Lucy sat up straight, her eyes cold. "Missing perfection. Do you think a dish like this is acceptable at a high-end restaurant? I think you should take it back to the kitchen." Carla looked directly at Lucy, her gaze steady. "Ma'am, this dish was prepared exactly as requested. But if you'd like, I can take it back to the kitchen for review." Lucy laughed, her laugh sharp and cold. "Yes, take it back. And next time, please pay more attention. I don't think you'd want to lose your job, would you?" Richard smirked, saying nothing, but his expression showed clear approval of Lucy's behavior. Carla picked up the tray of food and turned to walk away. Inside her, anger flared like a fire. She couldn't understand why Richard had chosen to humiliate her this way. Was he trying to prove that she had made a mistake by trusting him in the past? In another corner of the restaurant, a few customers were beginning to show their discomfort. A middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, named Xavier, glanced over at Richard and Lucy. He had been observing everything from the start and was clearly displeased. Xavier called another server over and whispered something in their ear. The server nodded and quickly walked away. In the kitchen, Alexander the shift manager approached Carla. "Carla, are you okay? If you need, I'll speak to the customers." Carla shook her head. "No need, Alexander. I can handle it." Alexander sighed. "But they're clearly crossing the line. I don't want this to go on any longer." Carla grabbed the tray of food, now revised, and headed back to Richard and Lucy's table. On the outside, she appeared calm, but inside, she knew this confrontation was far from over. Carla approached Richard and Lucy's table again, holding the tray firmly. She placed the dish in front of them with admirable composure, though Lucy's eyes still glinted with condescension and arrogance. "This is your salmon, revised as requested," Carla said, her voice steady. Lucy wasn't satisfied. She leaned forward, picking up her fork and cutting a small piece. She brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly before frowning as if she had just tasted something unpleasant. "Are you sure this is what I ordered, Carla?" Lucy asked, drawing out her words to catch the attention of those around her. Carla took a deep breath, trying not to let her emotions show. "Ma'am, this dish was prepared according to the recipe and rechecked in the kitchen. If there's anything else you're unhappy with, I deeply apologize." Lucy laughed, her laugh cold and mocking. "You apologize? I don't need your apology. I need quality. It's such a shame that this restaurant hires people who are as incompetent as you." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he watched Lucy's act with amusement. "I think you're right, Lucy. The service here needs an upgrade. Carla, don't you think you're embarrassing this establishment?" Carla clenched her fists, but she maintained her composure. "If you'd like to speak to the restaurant owner, I can arrange that for you. Please wait a moment." Carla turned and walked away, but she could feel the stares following her. Several customers in the restaurant whispered among themselves, their dissatisfaction evident on their faces. A middle-aged woman sitting nearby, named Mary, leaned over to her husband and said, "This is unacceptable. Those people are clearly trying to humiliate her." Her husband, Louis, nodded. "But you know, they're customers. No one dares intervene." Mary frowned, her eyes filled with indignation. "If this keeps up, I won't be able to stay quiet." In the kitchen, Carla approached Alexander. "They want to speak to the owner," she said, her tone patient but tinged with exhaustion. Alexander sighed, tension evident in his expression. "Xavier already knows. He wants to handle this personally. Carla nodded. Though Xavier was known for being a powerful and stern owner, he was always fair to his staff. She trusted that he wouldn't let Richard and Lucy cross the line. Meanwhile, at Richard and Lucy's table, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Lucy held her wine glass, taking a small sip before turning to Richard. "Do you see what I mean? It's ridiculous that a place like this would have employees like Carla. I don't understand why she thinks she deserves to work here." Richard smiled. "I agree. But, my love, perhaps we should teach her a lesson. If Xavier actually comes out here, I'd like to see how she'll be dealt with." Lucy chuckled dryly. "What do you think the owner of the restaurant will do? He'll definitely fire her. After all, customers like us are the ones who bring in the money." Richard shrugged, saying nothing. But inside, a sense of triumph was swelling within him. He felt like he was completely in control of the situation, and that filled him with satisfaction. A little while later, Xavier emerged from the kitchen. He was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes. His elegant black suit exuded authority and poise. All eyes in the restaurant turned toward him as he made his way to Richard and Lucy's table. "Good evening," Xavier said, his voice deep and clear. "I'm Xavier, the owner of this restaurant. I understand you wanted to speak with me." Lucy raised her eyebrows, momentarily surprised by Xavier's demeanor, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, that's correct. I'd like to complain about the service here, particularly about one of your employees, Carla. She's not competent enough to work in a place like this." Xavier remained calm, his gaze briefly passing over Richard before settling on Lucy. "Specifically, what seems to be the issue?" Lucy leaned back in her chair, feigning annoyance. "I've had to request changes to my food several times, and her attitude has been completely inappropriate. If I were you, I'd reconsider keeping her on staff." Xavier nodded slightly, his sharp eyes seeming to assess the situation. "I see. But perhaps we should have a more candid discussion." Lucy frowned, unsure of what Xavier was implying. She glanced at Richard, seeking his support. Richard, while maintaining his outward composure, felt a strange sense of unease building inside him. "Xavier, I don't understand why you're hesitating," Richard said, his voice lower than before. "Carla has clearly failed in her duties. I don't think there's any debate about that." Xavier tilted his head slightly, his piercing gaze seeming to bore into Richard. "Are you sure about that, Richard?" The simple yet pointed question made Richard falter. He didn't reply immediately, instead taking a sip of wine to mask his hesitation. "What do you mean by that?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Xavier didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to a nearby server. "Alexander, please bring Carla here. I think we need her to clarify things." Alexander nodded and quickly went into the kitchen. In the kitchen, Carla was standing next to Sam, taking deep breaths to steady herself. When Alexander approached and told her Xavier wanted to see her, she nodded. Despite her lingering turmoil, Xavier's presence gave her a small sense of reassurance. As Carla walked toward Richard and Lucy's table, she realized every eye in the restaurant was on her. The murmurs began to die down, giving way to a tense silence. "Carla," Xavier began, his voice steady and commanding, "I've received some complaints about your service. Do you have anything to say?" Carla looked Xavier directly in the eyes, then turned to face Richard and Lucy. She could feel the mockery in their stares, but she refused to be drawn into their provocations. "Sir, I've worked at this restaurant for 3 years and have always done my best to provide excellent service to our customers," Carla said, her voice calm but filled with strength. "If there is anything that didn't meet expectations, I'm willing to take responsibility. However, I don't believe the demands from this table have been reasonable." Lucy laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Are you saying that we're being unreasonable, Carla? Don't forget your place." Carla turned to Lucy, her gaze unwavering. Ma'am, I haven't forgotten my place. But I believe you shouldn't forget that respect is something everyone deserves, regardless of their position. Carla's response froze the air around the table. A few murmurs arose from nearby tables, and Xavier nodded slightly, as if satisfied with how Carla had handled the situation. Sensing the growing tension, Richard decided to intervene. He leaned back in his chair, lifting his wine glass but not drinking from it. Xavier, I think she's trying to dodge responsibility. If you don't want to address this issue, perhaps I should escalate it to upper management. Xavier raised an eyebrow, a cold smile flickering on his lips. Richard, you've always been someone who likes to cut straight to the point. So let me make it clear. Carla is one of my most dedicated employees. And if she made any mistakes tonight, I'm confident they weren't due to a lack of professionalism but rather to the way she's been treated. Lucy's eyes widened, unable to believe that Xavier was siding with Carla. Are you implying something? Are you saying this is our fault? Xavier turned to Lucy, his tone unchanged, but his gaze as sharp as a blade. I'm not implying anything. I'm making it very clear that my employees will not be humiliated by anyone, even customers. Xavier's words brought the entire restaurant to a standstill. A few customers nodded in agreement, while Richard and Lucy were clearly stunned by his response. Richard clenched his teeth, struggling to suppress his anger. Xavier, I don't think you should be saying that. We're customers, and I expect respect. Xavier leaned slightly toward Richard, his eyes cold. And I expect the same from my customers. Lucy opened her mouth to say something, but Richard raised a hand to stop her. He realized that Xavier was not someone who could be easily intimidated or swayed. Carla stood silently, quietly observing the scene. While she felt a sense of satisfaction that Xavier was standing up for her, her emotions were still mixed. Carla, Xavier said, his voice softening slightly, you can return to work. I'll handle the rest. Carla nodded, her eyes lingering on Richard one last time. In that moment, Richard felt as though Carla was looking straight into his soul, a cold, piercing look filled with contempt. Carla returned to the kitchen, leaving Richard and Lucy in an atmosphere of tension they were unaccustomed to. Murmurs from other tables in the restaurant began to grow louder. Many customers clearly disapproved of how Richard and Lucy had treated Carla, though no one intervened directly. Lucy took another sip of wine, trying to regain her composure. Richard, I can't believe this. He's actually taking her side. What kind of restaurant owner acts like that? Richard furrowed his brows, his expression icy. Xavier likes to think of himself as fair and righteous. But I think he's underestimating me. Lucy let out a laugh, but it sounded more forced than usual. Maybe we should just leave. I don't want to keep facing that kind of attitude. Richard set his wine glass down with a sharp clink against the table. No, my love. If we leave now, they'll think we've lost. I won't allow that. Lucy sighed, leaning back in her chair, her expression full of frustration. Fine, but I hope you'll do something to handle this situation. In the kitchen, Carla stood still for a moment, staring at the white tiled wall. Sam stood beside her, his expression full of concern. Carla, are you okay? Sam asked. Carla nodded slightly, though her voice revealed her exhaustion. I'm fine. I just don't want people like them to affect me. Sam looked at her and shook his head gently. You're really strong, but I know this isn't easy. Everyone can see they're deliberately trying to humiliate you. Carla gave a weary smile. Maybe they think they've won, but I'm not going to let them ruin my life again. Alexander walked over, his eyes filled with sympathy as he looked at Carla. Xavier is handling it. But if you'd like, I can take over that table for you from now on. Carla shook her head. Thank you, Alexander. But I want to finish this myself. I won't let them think I'm weak. Xavier returned to Richard and Lucy's table, his demeanor calm yet sharp. "Richard, Lucy," Xavier began, his voice deep and firm. "I've reviewed everything, and I believe I need to make a few things very clear." Lucy raised her eyebrows, trying to maintain her confidence. "We're listening, Xavier. I hope you'll handle this appropriately." Xavier let out a faint, dry laugh. "I've managed this restaurant for over 2 decades. During that time, I've dealt with many difficult customers. But I've always believed that respect is the foundation of any relationship, whether between customers and staff or simply between human beings." Richard leaned back in his chair, the smile on his face growing more strained. "Xavier, I don't think we need a lecture on ethics here. We just want better service, that's all." Xavier looked directly at Richard, his gaze cutting through every layer of composure the man tried to maintain. "Richard, the issue here isn't the service. The issue is the way you and your girlfriend have chosen to treat one of my employees, someone who has always done her job well. And that is unacceptable." Lucy opened her mouth to protest, but Xavier raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "If you're dissatisfied, I'm willing to have my employee apologize. But if you continue to act disrespectfully, I will have no choice but to ask you both to leave the restaurant." Xavier's words hit Richard like a punch to the ego. He clenched his fists, struggling to contain the anger rising within him. "Xavier, I'm your customer. I don't think you have the authority to ask me to leave." Xavier smirked, though his eyes remained cold. "You're right, Richard. You're a customer. But customers don't have the right to humiliate my staff. And I have every right to protect them." The atmosphere in the restaurant was as heavy as a brewing storm. Richard and Lucy remained seated, their eyes tense as if waiting for Xavier to make his final move. Around them, customers and staff began whispering again, the quiet hum of voices falling silent as Xavier spoke. "Richard, Lucy," Xavier said, his voice steady and commanding. "I think it's time I revealed something else. You may not know this, but Carla isn't just one of my employees. She's a co-owner of this restaurant and a significant stakeholder in several other properties in this city." The atmosphere seemed to freeze for a moment. Richard frowned, his eyes filled with confusion. Lucy, usually so composed and proud, now looked at Xavier in stunned disbelief. "Co-owner?" Richard repeated, his voice thick with skepticism. "You must be joking. Carla, no way." Xavier smirked coldly. "You think I'm joking? If you don't believe me, I can show you the documents. But I don't think that's necessary, because the truth remains the truth." Lucy quickly interjected, trying to regain her confident demeanor. "Xavier, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Carla is just a server. How could she possibly own this restaurant?" Xavier turned to Lucy, his gaze icy. "Lucy, I don't need to explain anything to you. But for clarity, Carla is my wife. We built this restaurant together from the ground up. And currently, she's not only my wife but also the legal co-owner of this establishment and all the other properties we manage." Silence engulfed the entire restaurant. Servers like Sam, Alexander, and a few others, including Sophia and Andres, stood frozen, their eyes wide with surprise and admiration for Carla. Meanwhile, Richard and Lucy seemed unable to believe their ears. "Your wife?" Richard said, his voice stiffening. "You're telling me, Carla, this woman is married to someone like you?" Xavier's brow furrowed, and his voice turned cold. "Careful with your words, Richard. I won't allow anyone to insult my wife." Lucy began to lose her composure. "But how is that even possible? Someone like her." "Enough, Lucy," Xavier interrupted, his tone commanding. "I don't care what you think. The only thing I know is that Carla deserves respect. And from this moment forward, I will not tolerate any further disrespect toward her." The murmurs in the restaurant began to grow louder. Some customers whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with disdain as they looked at Richard and Lucy. Among them, a middle-aged man named Anthony, seated near Richard's table, shook his head and said to his companion, "I've never seen anyone so brazen. Carla doesn't deserve to be treated like that." Beside Anthony, a woman named Mary responded softly, "Xavier handled that perfectly. Let's see if they dare try anything else." Richard clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was rattled. "Xavier, I think you're overstepping here. We are your customers, and we have the right to expect the best service. And I have the right to protect my employees, especially when that employee is also the co-owner of this restaurant," Xavier replied, his tone calm but resolute. "If you cannot behave appropriately, I will have no choice but to ask you to leave." Lucy forced a nervous laugh, trying to recover. "Xavier, perhaps we've misunderstood each other. I truly didn't mean to insult Carla. Maybe I was just a little too upset because I wanted a perfect evening." Xavier looked at Lucy, the faint smile on his lips razor-sharp. "Lucy, I appreciate your attempt, but your words won't change the facts. I hope you understand that every action has consequences." Meanwhile, Carla stood at a distance, quietly observing. Her expression was no longer tense, instead, it was calm and composed. Despite Richard and Lucy's deliberate provocations, Carla knew that Xavier had her back. Sam approached Carla and whispered, "Carla, you're truly strong. I don't think they can do anything else after this." Carla smiled gently. "Thank you, Sam. But all I want is for this to end peacefully." Carla's words reflected her maturity and confidence. Despite being subjected to insult and mockery, she maintained her composure, earning admiration from those around her. Xavier turned back to Richard and Lucy for the final time. "I'll leave it up to you to decide. If you'd like to continue your dinner, I expect there will be no further disrespectful behavior. But if you can't manage that, the door is right behind you." Lucy glanced at Richard, her face full of uncertainty. She knew they had gone too far, but Richard's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. "We don't need to stay here any longer," Richard said, his tone rigid. "Just wait, Xavier. You'll regret treating us like this." Xavier smirked faintly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm always ready to face the consequences, Richard. But the real question is, are you ready to face yourself?" Richard didn't reply. He stood up, grabbed Lucy's hand, and stormed out of the restaurant under the disdainful gazes of the other patrons. The scene felt like a public indictment of their arrogance. Lucy walked in her sparkling high heels, each step heavier than the last, weighed down by the humiliation. She turned to glance back at Xavier one final time, her eyes burning with resentment. "Xavier, you'll regret this. I promise you that." Xavier remained unfazed, his gaze icy. "Lucy, you can say whatever you want. But I will not change my decision." As Richard and Lucy neared the door, a few customers seated nearby couldn't hide their satisfaction. Anthony, the middle-aged man, shook his head with a small chuckle. "Serves them right. Who do they think they are?" Mary, sitting beside Anthony, agreed. They didn't realize that Carla and Xavier are one of the most respected couples in this city. Trying to humiliate Carla was asking for trouble. Sam, standing near Anthony's table, smiled softly. He thought to himself that justice had been served, at least within the walls of this restaurant. As Richard and Lucy stepped out the door, Alexander, the shift manager, approached Xavier. "Xavier, do you think they'll come back to cause trouble?" Xavier let out a small laugh, his eyes full of confidence. "Alexander, if they come back, I'll deal with them again. But I don't think they'll have the nerve to try." Outside the restaurant, Richard angrily yanked Lucy's arm. "What the hell were you doing? If you'd kept your mouth shut, we wouldn't have been thrown out." Lucy pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing. "You're blaming me? Richard, don't forget that it was your idea to provoke Carla in the first place. What were you thinking, bringing me here and trying to humiliate her? Richard turned away, his shoulders tense. He couldn't deny the truth in Lucy's words, but his wounded pride kept him from admitting it. I don't need you to lecture me, Lucy. All I wanted was to make her understand that I still have control over everything. Lucy let out a dry laugh, but it was laced with mockery. Control? What have you controlled? Carla is now wealthier and more powerful than you could ever dream of. You couldn't even manage to unsettle her. Richard clenched his fists, a mix of humiliation and regret swirling inside him. Lucy's words were like daggers plunging straight into the ego already bruised by Xavier's words. Inside the restaurant, Carla stood by a secluded corner, gazing out the window. She saw Richard and Lucy arguing fiercely outside. A faint sadness crept into her heart. Though years had passed, Richard was once the man she loved. Now, he was merely a shadow of the person he used to be. Sam approached Carla, his voice soft. Carla, are you okay? Carla nodded slightly, a weary smile gracing her lips. I'm fine, Sam. I just didn't expect Richard to turn out like this. He used to be a very different man. Sam nodded quietly, unsure of what to say. He understood that Carla was experiencing a difficult moment, even if she didn't show it outwardly. Xavier walked over, placing a hand gently on Carla's shoulder. You don't need to think about him anymore, Carla. Richard doesn't deserve any of your attention. Carla turned to look at Xavier, her eyes softening. I know. But sometimes, I can't help but wonder, what made him become the man he is now? Xavier remained silent for a moment before speaking, his voice deep and resolute. He made his choices, Carla. And we've made ours. I believe we've chosen the right path. Xavier's words felt like a reassurance, easing the weight Carla carried. She smiled faintly and placed her hand on his. You're right. I shouldn't let the past hold me back. At another table in the restaurant, Anthony stood and walked over to Xavier and Carla. Xavier, I just want to say you handled that situation beautifully. People like Richard and Lucy don't deserve to be here. Xavier shook Anthony's hand, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Thank you, Anthony. I just did what needed to be done to protect my restaurant and my staff. Anthony turned to Carla, his gaze filled with respect. Carla, you're truly a strong woman. Not everyone could remain as composed as you did in such a situation. Carla smiled softly, her voice gentle. Thank you, Anthony. But honestly, everything I've managed to do is because of Xavier and the incredible team here. Sam, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. Carla, you're not only strong, but you're an inspiration to all of us. Sam's words moved Carla deeply. Despite all the challenges she had faced, hearing these words of support made her feel that all her efforts were worthwhile. Outside, Richard and Lucy finally got into the car. Neither of them spoke a word. The air inside was tense and cold. Richard stared straight ahead, a sense of emptiness enveloping him. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew he had been wrong. The car rolled down the dark street, streetlights illuminating Richard's cold, expressionless face. Lucy sat beside him with her arms crossed, her eyes filled with disappointment. The tension in the car was so thick it felt almost tangible. What are you thinking about, Richard? Lucy suddenly asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Did you think taking me to that restaurant was a good idea? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Richard didn't reply immediately. He stared at the steering wheel, his hands gripping it tightly as if trying to suppress the anger boiling inside him. Lucy, could you just be quiet for a moment? I don't want to argue right now. Don't want to argue. Lucy scoffed coldly. You lost, Richard. You've got nothing left. That Carla you always look down on now stands in a position you'll never reach. Richard let out a sigh, his gaze drifting off. In his mind, Xavier's words echoed relentlessly. Are you ready to face yourself? That question pierced his thoughts, leaving him restless. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, the atmosphere was returning to normal. Guests resumed their meals, but the story of Carla and Xavier remained the main topic of conversation. Carla stood in the kitchen, feeling a sense of relief that everything was finally over. Alexander walked up, admiration clear in his eyes. Carla, I truly admire how you handled that. Not everyone could have stayed as composed as you did. Carla offered a small smile, though it carried a hint of sadness. Thank you, Alexander. But honestly, I just wanted everything to end as quickly as possible. I don't want to hold on to negative emotions. Alexander nodded. That's exactly why everyone here respects you so much. Xavier entered, his gaze gentle as he looked at Carla. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. Are you okay, Carla? I'm okay, Carla replied, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Thank you, Xavier. If it weren't for you, I don't know if I could have held it together. Xavier smiled, taking her hand in his. You don't need to thank me. I'm always here for you. His words were a promise, a commitment that Xavier would always be Carla's steadfast support, no matter what challenges arose. On the other side of the city, Richard stopped the car in front of a small bar. Lucy frowned, irritated. What are you doing here? We should go home, Richard. Richard didn't respond. He opened the car door and stepped out without even glancing at Lucy. If you don't want to join me, then stay here. I don't care. Lucy, clearly annoyed, eventually got out of the car as well. You really are pathetic, Richard. Do you think drinking is going to solve anything? Walking into the bar, Richard chose a secluded corner and ordered a strong drink. Lucy sat across from him, her gaze filled with disdain. Are you planning to sit here all night? Richard took a sip of his drink but didn't answer. Deep down, he knew Lucy was right. He had failed, not just at the restaurant but in his life as a whole. Images of Carla kept flashing in his mind, her steadfast gaze, her calm but powerful smile. He couldn't deny that she had surpassed him, not only in status but also in character. Lucy kept complaining, but Richard barely listened. His mind was consumed with questions. How did it come to this? Was it my fault, or someone else's? At the same time, back at the restaurant, Xavier and Carla sat together after the last customers had left. Sam and Alexander, along with a few other employees, gathered around them, creating an atmosphere that felt warmer than ever. Carla, you're truly an inspiration to us, Sophia, young server, said. The way you handled Richard and Lucy was really admirable. Carla smiled gently, her eyes soft. Thank you, Sophia. But remember, the most important thing isn't defeating others, it's maintaining your composure and self-respect. Her words felt like a lesson for everyone in the restaurant. Nobody added anything further, but their eyes reflected agreement and admiration. Xavier held Carla's hand, his voice filled with affection. I'm so proud of you, Carla. You're not only a strong woman but also someone who inspires everyone here. Carla looked at Xavier, her smile brighter than ever. Thank you, Xavier. But I think the most important thing is that we have each other. Outside the bar, Richard stood up, his eyes now devoid of anger. Instead, they carried a hollowness and exhaustion. He turned to Lucy, his voice dropping. I don't think we should continue this anymore. Lucy frowned, confused. What are you talking about? I'm tired, Lucy, Richard said, his voice coming from a place deep within him. Of everything. You, me, this life. I don't want to keep living like this. Lucy laughed, but it was a bitter, uncomfortable sound. What nonsense are you talking about? You can't leave me, Richard. Richard didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Lucy behind, her expression filled with shock. He knew he needed to change, but for the first time in his life, he didn't know where to start. As Richard stepped onto the street, the glow of the streetlights illuminated his face. He took a deep breath, as if trying to rediscover himself. Deep inside, he thought, Carla was right. Happiness doesn't lie in what you have, but in how you live. The story of Carla, Xavier, Richard, and Lucy emphasizes the value of self-respect, fairness, and the importance of how we treat others. Carla teaches us that true strength lies in composure and confidence when facing challenges, while Xavier exemplifies loyalty and protection for those he loves. In contrast, Richard and Lucy serve as a lesson on the consequences of arrogance, disrespect, and poor behavior. Ultimately, true happiness is not about power but about character and how one chooses to live.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.